Well, I think there are two reasons. The first one, and I don't mean these in order of importance, but the first one is that if your currency is the global currency, it operates like an immense subsidy to your country. Think of it in the simplest way. You can buy from other countries the goods and services they have poured their creative effort into. The wine from France, the software program from Korea, or whatever. And what do you pay for it? Little green pieces of paper, the US dollar, cost you nothing to produce. You can send the dollars over there, and because it's the global currency, the local bank will keep some of the dollars. It will trade into its central bank some of those dollars, but they won't come back in the purchase of goods and services. In a normal situation of two countries, neither of whose currencies are global currencies, the only way they can pay for the import of goods and services is by exporting alternative goods and services that the other side of the party of the exchange wants. So it is an enormous subsidy that, for example, the world traded in oil, an enormously important product, using dollars, because Saudi Arabia and other countries created the petrodollar economy in the world. And the United States came out of World War II as the new global hegemon. By the way, the same thing applies earlier to the British Empire, when the British pound sterling played the same kind of role. So other countries want in on that. They don't want to be the ones who have to hold on to somebody else's currency. They want to be the beneficiaries of having their currency play that kind of role, if not instead of the United States dollar, certainly alongside it. All right, that's the first thing. Here's the second one. There is a feeling that the United States, particularly in the last few years, has gone beyond gaining the subsidies. And I forgot to mention one more subsidy that's implicit. The rest of the world holds the dollar, but they don't like to hold literally the dollar because it earns them nothing. So you know what they do with all the dollars they have? They lend them back to the United States government. For example, China and Japan are together the number one and number two creditors of the United States. China alone has nearly a trillion dollars of U.S. Treasury securities that it owns. So ironically, the United States gets the subsidy of using dollars and then gets a loan of those dollars back to cover its own governmental budget deficits. Other countries want in on this lovely arrangement. But there's a second reason. The United States, because it's a declining empire now, painful as that is for Americans to wrap their heads around, but in part because of that, the United States made the decision some years ago to weaponize its global currency, its position as the global currency. And you could see it dramatically when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. The United States seized the assets of Russia. It stopped playing the role of, quote, neutral arbiter of the global currency, as if it were above the fray. It's not above the fray now. It's using it. It's sanctioning. It's excluding people from the SWIFT system of dollar payment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Under these circumstances, other countries now have a defensive reason. They don't want the US dollar because it gives the United States power and reach into their economies, taking away some of their sovereignty. And now that the United States feels it can sanction literally dozens of countries who trade with Cuba or trade with Iran or trade with China or Russia, and the number keeps growing, there's a defensive impulse. Whoa, we don't want this. You put the desire to participate together with the defense against the weaponization, and then you have the following realities, and these are important for Americans to cope with. 20 years ago, 2/3 or more of global reserves held by central banks were held in the form of a dollar, gold, and maybe a little bit of euros, and possibly a little bit of Japanese yen. Today, less than 45% of global reserves are held in the form of a dollar. It's not a discussion about de-dollarization may happen. De-dollarization has happened and is continuing at a rising pace. Let me give you yet another couple of statistics. If you compare the G7, the United States and its allies, including Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, they now account for about 29% of global GDP. If you take the BRICS, China and its allies, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, as well as China, they now account for 32% of the world's GDP. One of them is larger than the other, and the gap between them is getting enormous and fast. The rest of the world has no business putting all their eggs in a dollar basket when the core of that basket is becoming less and less of an economic factor in the global system. There is no way to pretend that this is not happening. And so you put all these things together, add that the Saudi Arabian dominance in oil has now switched, and the Saudis are making deals to sell oil in a whole host of currencies. And yeah, the dollar cannot play the role it did before. It should never have been expected to continue. The desperate effort of the United States to now weaponize it has only given a greater impetus to people to back away around the world. And I think the implications of this and the consequences are going to be big shapers of the American economic situation for many years to come. Transitions take time. I'm a historian. I'm amazed at how fast it's going. To say, as you just did, and you're right, that 20 years ago, by the way, it was closer to 70% than 60, but that 20 years ago, it was 70% of world reserves held in dollars, and today it's 45. By historical measure, that's spectacularly fast. Yeah, of course, if you've had the dollar as the dominant world currency for 75 years since the end of World War II, yeah, then people are used to that. Now they're becoming used to the dollar not being all that valuable. And, you can see that in terms of what happened to the British pound. Nobody is anymore holding significant amounts of the British pound because the British Empire is gone. And the American empire, as it shrinks, as it is surpassed already by that comparison I made between the G7 and the BRICS, the direction of change is unmistakable. Just take the first 3 months of this year, January, February, March. What was the economic rate of growth of GDP in Europe? Nothing. The negative of Germany, which is now in recession, offset the rest of the whole area. No growth at all. What was the growth in the first quarter of the United States GDP? 1.3%. What's the rate of growth in the People's Republic of China? 4.5%. This is a no-brainer which way the world is going. If you're a society if you're an economic unit, well, let me give you this example. Over the last month, Warren Buffett, his associate Charlie Munger, Elon Musk, Jamie Dimon, where are they? They're all in Beijing. Why are they in Beijing? Because they're there. I'm going to quote you Warren Buffett, because the tension between the United States and China, quoting Warren Buffett, is stupid. That's the word he used. We need each other. We are one step short, in his language, of what I'm saying. We are a declining economic reality. They are the growth area. Their wages are lower. Their economic growth is greater. I've been a part of business school education. You teach people in a business school, you want your corporation to succeed, go where the costs are minimal and the rate of growth of your market is maximal. That's your recipe. Figure it out, go there. Well, you know what? That's an argument not to decouple or de-risk or any of the euphemisms having to do with China. The losses for American companies that have been investing in China for 30 years and that see the economic growth emerging from that part of the world is dictating what they do. The biggest problem for the American politicians who want to build their careers off of China bashing is that they've got the American corporate mega companies on the other side of the issue for them. But these are signs. Dollarization is done. It's only now a question of how far it will go down further, whether global reserves will once again be some dollars, some Chinese yuan, some euros, and then a mixture or a basket of alternatives that are being looked into now. But the initiative of the global economic, it's unmistakable. The BRICS, there's a dozen countries that have applied to join the BRICS. You know, it's really quite clear where things are going, except here in the United States. I don't know about Canada, where there's a need to practice what psychologists call denial on an extraordinary scale, and denial never solved anything. I think the best way to understand what is happening is to remember what the history of capitalism has always been. Capitalism uses the resources, physical, human, in whatever area it exists, and then it moves on. You know, capitalism begins in 17th century England. It moves from there to Western Europe. Slowly, the great British Empire built on capitalism shrinks, and the European challenger, Germany, and the old British colony America in the 19th century challenge it. And the core center of capitalism leaves England and never goes back to this day. Now look at it here in the United States. Capitalism grows in New England. Then it leaves New England. If you've ever visited New England, I live in that part of the country, it's still got the remnants, the 4-story brick factories that are now empty because nobody has had any business to do in them, but they were once the center of textiles and furniture and clothing and all the rest of it. And where did they go? To the Midwest. And what do we call the Midwest in the United States today? The Rust Belt, because capitalism left. And then it went to the South and the Southwest, and then to Canada and Mexico, and then to China and Brazil and India. The reason the United States is in a decline is because capitalism has abandoned it. Capitalism's core went to China and the BRICS countries because the wages were cheaper, the regulation was less, and the markets were growing. And that has been the rule of capitalism always. When the United States was the place where it was growing, the place to which capitalism came, it was a good ride up. But when you're the site of where it's leaving, it's not a good ride down. Just ask New England or the Midwest or any of the others. So the first reason is not about countries. It's about how capitalism works. We trained the people who moved the jobs from Cincinnati to Shanghai. They are the products of a capitalism. And when you're left, you get called the Rust Belt. In 1970, Detroit had 2 million people. Today, the population of Detroit is 680,000. That's what happened. And that's what's happening to the United States. And you're going to see with AI, artificial intelligence, this process taking another several steps forward. And guess what? The United States is moving to what it used to think was the way other countries were, A small group of well-off people living in charmed cities, in gated communities, and a mass of poor people living in the suburbs, in the rural areas. That kind of dichotomy is found in many parts of the world, and that's what's evolving here. Look at the last 40 years. The distribution of income and wealth in this country has systematically gotten worse. Even after president points that out and says he's committed, nothing changes. The process continues. It's like listening to them saying, we're going to bring manufacturing back. They never did it. These are verbalisms that cover over a reality in which capitalism has moved its dynamic center away from North America, away from Japan and Western Europe, to, the BRICS countries, because they're inheriting the future of capitalism at this point. And that has to be faced. I'm an opponent of the UBI. I understand the good motivation that lies behind many of the proposals. So I'm not against the motivation, but I don't think that's a good solution. And let me explain by going back to the issue of AI. AI is one of a long list of technical breakthroughs. Robots, computers, before that, electricity, before that, atomic energy, before that, the machine, and so on. In every one of these cases, AI included, here's what we have. We have an invention that will allow people to do twice as much work, just to take a simple example, with the new invention compared to what they were able to do before. And now let's follow the logic. For a capitalist, this is a wonderful opportunity. If I have a machine, AI, and I can do with 50 workers what I used to have to buy 100 workers to achieve, I'm going to do exactly what Goldman Sachs assumes. I am going to produce the same amount of output with half the number of workers. I will sell the output at the same price. I'll make the same revenue. But the one thing that will have changed, half of my wage costs are not there anymore. So me as a capitalist, I get to keep the portion of the revenue that I used to use to pay half my workers is now mine. So AI has proven to be very profitable for me to install. And since I'm a capitalist, I'm not responsible for the 50 people I fired. They have to go, they're on their own. All right. Now, here you get me as a critic of capitalism. There's obviously an alternative. Mathematics teaches us that all the time. Here's the alternative. You take everybody who's working and you put them on half time. Then they can produce exactly as much as they did because the AI will allow them to do in 4 hours a day what before it took them 8 hours a day. Wow. Now you have the same output with the same labor force. You're earning the same revenue, which means you can pay everybody what you did before, earn exactly what profit you earned before. That would be an alternative way to handle any technical invention. But here's the difference. Instead of it boosting the profit of the employer, it would boost the leisure of the workers, who are the majority here. So if you had a democratically governed technical change, you would give the leisure to the large group rather than the profit to the small group. This would be the kind of progress which a critique of capitalism allows you to identify and move toward. What Goldman Sachs is doing is thinking, like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, without understanding what the critique of capitalism is, which would have allowed them to understand there were more options than those it sees. So all it has is alarms about all the unemployed. Yes, I think basically that's true. And let me explain. The The reason that Marxism has its bad name in this country and why most people are either unaware or a bit frightened or maybe both about it has to do with the Cold War. It was quite different before 1945. I want to remind everyone that World War II was a war in which the United States had as its ally the Soviet Union. If during the 1940s, early 40s, you went to a U.S. post office, you would have purchased your stamps under a sign which had a cartoon figure of Uncle Sam in his typical top hat, arm in arm with Uncle Joe. That was Joseph Stalin, whose picture was in the American post office because we were allies. It was not only possible then to talk about Marxism, but everybody was doing it. They were doing it in the 1930s because we had the Great Depression, and they were doing it in the 1940s, the first half, because we were allied with the Soviet communists against the German fascists. After the war, everything changed. The United States went into a Cold War with the former ally, the Soviet Union, and everything having to do with the evil other, in this case, Russia, which included their commitment to Marxism and socialism, became taboo in the United States. It went so far, and this is a critique of the United States I'm offering, it went so far that you didn't pick up a book by a Marxist, you didn't read Karl Marx, and that's foolish. And that's kind of embarrassing. I say that as a person born and lived and worked all my life in the United States. But to not understand the most important critique of capitalism that has ever been produced over the last 150 years is not an achievement. It's an embarrassing flaw. It's kind of putting your hands over your eyes in the imagination that you will therefore not see the problem. So from roughly 1945 to about 2008, a long time, half a century, it was taboo. Let me give you a concrete example. I was a student at Harvard University. I went there for 4 years, got my bachelor's degree, don't mind telling you, magna cum laude on top of it. I was never assigned a single word by Karl Marx. I took economics courses, history courses, sociology courses. My professors talked to us as if this whole idea, this whole philosophy, this whole way of thinking critically about capitalism didn't exist. At Yale, where I got my PhD in economics, I was in the same classes with a woman you may have heard of, my classmate, Janet Yellen. We took the same courses from the same professors, reading the same books. We were not ever exposed to Marxist anything. And the work of our political leaders is poorer because they were never exposed to a critical perspective. I got interested because the questions I asked about economics were not answered to my satisfaction. I found my way to the Marxist books in the library at Harvard and Yale. I read them and I learned a lot. And ever after that, to this day, I am not going to run away from the intellectual debt I have to the critical approach. And let me put it to you in a parable. If you were a professor like me, and you gave your students an assignment, there's a family up the street, mother, father, 2 children. One of the children thinks that the family is the greatest thing they ever could encounter, and the other one thinks the family they live in is a psychological basket case. And I gave the student the assignment, go up there and write an essay. Would the student, about the family, would the student talk to only one of the 2 children? I would hope not, because that would be inadequate intellectual openness. You talk to both of them. You can draw whatever conclusions you want, but you don't close off one source of understanding. That's stupid, which is the nicest word I can think of it. So, yes, over the last 20 years, especially after the crisis of 2008 and 9, more and more Americans and more people around the world are aware that capitalism has a lot of problems associated to it. And interestingly, particularly young people are open to looking at places like Marxism to see what explanations of capitalism's flaws might be of interest and might have insights you could use. Well, again, there's a bit of a confusion here. Marx referred to himself mostly as a socialist. There really weren't things called communists way back then, or they were very, very few. And his use of the term Communist Manifesto was to be provocative, was to get attention, which was very successful. But it was not an argument. There were no communist political parties of any importance at that time. And most of the time when he wrote about alternatives, he used the word socialism. I'd also want to remind you that both Russia under the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China tend to use the word socialism. Xi Jinping refers to socialism with Chinese characteristics to define his society. Lenin and the leaders of the Soviet Union also used the word socialism to describe it. And for example, USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They did not want to talk about communism because for them, that was a future they might someday arrive at, but not one that they were in. All right, so let's deal with socialism. Probably the most widely known examples of socialism are what we call Scandinavian or Western Europe. Our mission is to say, look, capitalism has its virtues. Capitalism has its achievements. We're not making a cheap shot here. We're not interested in that. We're interested in doing something that human beings have always done. Can we do better than what we have? And my answer is, of course we can. We are glad that we gave up slavery because we could do better than that. And we're glad as a human race we gave up feudalism. Capitalism also, we can do better. The idea that capitalism is the end of history is preposterous. The burden isn't on me to argue that it isn't. The burden is on anybody who, having seen all the different phases of human history, should think this one that we happen to be in is the end of the process. No, I think we can do better. In particular, I'm a Democrat with a small d, not the Democratic Party. I like democracy. I like the notion of one person, one vote, and we get together as a community of equals to make the decisions. And I would like to see that in the workplace, which is where it has always been excluded. You go to work, you cross the threshold into your factory, your office, your store, and suddenly a small group of people you don't elect tell you what to do. Take the fruit of your labor and decide whether to sell it, to who to sell it, the price at which it is sold, and what to do with the net proceeds. I don't like that. I don't like it because it's undemocratic. I find it bizarre that I get to vote for the mayor of the city I live in or the congressperson, but I don't get to vote for the person where I work. 5 days a week, I go to work. The best hours of the day, I'm at work. If I believe in democracy, why isn't it at work? Where is it written in the Bible or anywhere else that there can't be democracy at the workplace? I think we'd be more productive and happier as a people if we had a democratic workplace. And I think half the motivation of people who quit their capitalist jobs, maybe to start a startup with a few friends or on their own. Here again, you're going to see, as I answer your question, this projecting forward of the unique position of the United States coming out of World War II. I guess I have to hammer at that for a moment. Please remember with me, at the end of the war, the United States had had one experience with bombs falling on its territory. That was Pearl Harbor at the beginning. Never again. No damage was done here in the United States. No bombs fell, no explosions happened, no invasion occurred, none of it. We lost some troops, but relatively much less than other countries. Meanwhile, all the potential competitors of the United States, Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, but even Britain, France, Italy, who are our part of allies, part of opponents, they were all defeated. They were all destroyed. Their factories were bombed, their railroads wrecked, all the rest of it. So we came out a unique position. We held that unique position for most of the rest of the 20th century, the second half of that century, when we could do pretty much what we wanted. It didn't matter. We were so dominant, the economic system here. We helped the others rebuild from the war in Japan, in Western Europe, and so on. And we could do what we wanted. They had this notion that you're kind of alone in the world, that everybody has to adjust to you. That's over. And now it won't work. I'm going to explain why these tariffs are a mistake, as if you were in the position you were before. So I will slap you with a tariff and I will not suffer consequences. This is completely wrong. I'm going to give you the example. The best example, the easiest one, electric vehicles. They are the vehicles of the future. Between the damage to our health and the damage to the resource base of this planet, burning fossil fuels to move our cars and trucks is on the way out. It's going to be replaced not by the rational decision, that would be mass transportation, but by the irrational but profitable decision to substitute electric vehicles for fossil fuel burning vehicles. Given that, here's the reality. The Chinese participated, along with the Europeans and the Americans, over the last 15 years to produce a profitable electric vehicle. That competition has been won by the Chinese, above all by a particular company, BYD. And if you don't know what that company is, that's a sign of denying what's going on in the world. In this case, by the mass media who haven't told you about it. BYD produces the highest quality, lowest price electric car and truck. Bingo, there it is. They're selling it all over the world, including Europe, by the way. But you won't find those vehicles on the roads in the United States today. Nowhere, not at all. Why? Because there's currently a 100% tariff. What that means is if the car costs $30,000 bringing it in from China, you and I would have to pay $60,000 to buy it. 30 to the Chinese manufacturer and 30 to Uncle Sam, because that's what the tariff is, a tax. Here's what that means, my fellow Americans. All over the world, every company that makes things that compete with American products, companies that make shirts, companies that make food, companies that make software programs, they make anything. They all have to buy cars and trucks. It's part of their business. They're going to get the best quality, cheapest electric truck, and that will be reflected in low prices for what they produce. In contrast, Americans who have to pay way more for those electric trucks with the big tariff will charge much more for their products than their foreign competitors, and they'll lose business. And you and I will lose our jobs. Why? Because of the tariff. So this may sound good. It may look like you're being a tough guy, Mr. Trump or Ms. Harris. But what you're doing is playing a silly political game that will come back and bite you and me where it hurts. It is a crazy misunderstanding of how the world now works. Well, if ever you wanted an example of the notion of unintended consequences, here you have it. The last thing that the United States' neocon foreign policy establishment wanted was to strengthen Russia. They seem to have decided that Russia is the great problem in the world and that they would concentrate on damaging, weakening Russia. That's a major part, not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it, the sanctions program of stopping purchases of oil and gas by Europe from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of the cheapness, European products were lower priced. They didn't have to raise the price as much because they got the cheap energy. And that made European economies successful, competitive, able to export, which the engine of European growth has been. Germany, above all, as an exporter. All of that was undercut when the sanctions went into effect in order to weaken Russia. But they didn't work. And they didn't work for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason that those policies didn't work is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners, its BRICS allies, with whom Russia had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS wasn't an organization formed last year or the year before. It's older. And Russia had cultivated, in lots of ways, relationships with India, China, South Africa, Brazil, the people who make up, the countries that make up BRICS. And so they bought Russian oil and gas, to make a complex story short and sweet. And Russia wasn't weakened. Russia turned out to be strengthened. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to the BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. In order for India and China to buy the oil and gas from Russia, they had to work out the economics of this enormous business imposed on them by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 Europe allies, plus Japan. And so the BRICS became better coordinated, more dependent one on the other, more having their economies intertwined. Bottom line, Russia and the BRICS became stronger, and the United States became less powerful because of it, more isolated because of their own decisions to have the war in Ukraine, which wasn't necessary. And that isolation of the United States is now deepening because of its decision to be as supportive unilaterally to Israel as they have decided to be. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been to isolate the United States. And that leads me to perhaps the most important point. The world has changed, and the United States is denying that to its own detriment. The BRICS is now a larger economic powerhouse than is the United States or the G7. China is coming closer and closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States, as everyone knows. The prognosis for the United States, if it continues along the lines you've just summarized, and you summarized them right, is very grim. It is for more isolation of the United States. Let me give you a few statistics. I'm an economist. People expect it of me. Let me give them to you because they crystallize, I think, what is going on. I decided, because of the BRICS conference, to take a look at how the economies of the G7, the United States and its major allies, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, how they're doing in terms of economic growth, and then compare it to the 5 major BRICS countries. And I do that because the financial press here in the United States, participating in the denial I've been telling you about, has recently been congratulating itself because the economic growth of the United States for this year, 2024, which we can now estimate because most of the year is behind us, is scheduled to be 2.8%. Let me ask everyone, keep that in your mind, 2.8% growth in the GDP, the gross domestic product. That's a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in 1 year. That's expected to grow 2.8%, and that's faster than any one of the other of the G7. That is, all of Europe, Japan, Canada, going to grow even less. Okay, now let me compare that first to Russia, the other side of the Ukraine war. Their economic growth rate, and by the way, all these numbers come from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, a Western institution dominated by the G7. So that's where the numbers come from. 2.8%, rah-rah, United States. Russia's growth in 2024, ready? 3.9%. That's a lot more, an awful lot more than 2.8. America wishes it could grow 3.9. Can't get anywhere near it, but we haven't begun. Let's turn next to China, 4.8. That's almost double the economic growth rate of the United States this year. And then we come to India, which is 7%, almost triple the level of the United States. And I wouldn't bring you these numbers for 1 year if they weren't, in fact, the kinds of numbers we have seen for decades. That's why the Chinese are where they are. They caught up. They grew faster. They figured out how to raise the standard of living of their people much faster than anyone ever did before. This is not an endorsement of the Chinese economy or society or suggesting they don't have lots of problems. They do. All countries do. They do too. But when it comes to economic growth, that's their strong suit, folks. And that's what makes the difference in the world economy, doesn't it? To pretend that this isn't going on, that this isn't suggesting where the future lies, of course they have a good humor among themselves at their conference. They are the growing, dynamic core of the world economy now. The West isn't. And that's not about to change. That's why you have to come to terms with it, rather than pretending that such situations don't exist or that it's all about Mr. Putin. It isn't. Let me remind you of another statistic. This GDP, this gross domestic product, the total output of goods and services in a year, we economists use that as a rough measure of how big, how important an economy is. What is its footprint in the whole global planetary economic system that we're all a part of? Okay, the GDP of the United States remains number 1 in the world, somewhere between 25 and 30 trillion dollars a year. That's the legacy of being the dominant economy for the last century. What is the GDP of Russia, our so-called enemy? 2 trillion, maybe 3. People should understand Russia has never been an economic threat to the United States. It can't be. It's too small. It may have a powerful military, Lord knows, but economically, not at all. The United States could, if it worked out an arrangement, easily come to terms with an economy that's so much smaller. The Chinese economy, that's a completely different thing. Their GDP is around 17, 18 trillion dollars, catching up exactly. And Russia and China together, and India and